So this video I'm going to go over how to start printing. So this block is one that I've printed several times. You can see it's kind of hard to see the actual contrast in it. So if you guys, whenever you start printing, it'll be really easy to see the contrast between the areas you've actually carved out of the block, because they'll be much lighter, a light gray, and then you have the darker gray of linoleum there. So once we actually apply the ink, that will be even more visible, so it'll be easier to tell where the ink's actually getting onto the block. To start printing, what we're going to do is some proof printing. So we'll do that on newsprint first. So before you guys actually start printing on the good paper that you've torn down, you go through a series of proof prints. So that's to do a couple of things. One, just to kind of gauge your progress. So if you're at a point where you feel like you might be done carving, you're not entirely sure, best thing to do is just bring it in here, roll up this make, proof print it, again, just directly on newsprint. That'll give you kind of a clearer idea of if you need to go back into the block, remove some more areas, carve some things down a little bit deeper. And also just kind of gives you a little bit of practice and experience, so it helps with press calibration, how much ink you're applying, things like that. So basically it's kind of just your initial trial runs. So again, we have our block here. So I have a few of these available in the shop. They are silicone mats. It's not an absolute necessity. I only have 3 of them available, but it is nice to have, so it provides you with a non-slip surface. So you're not just putting this directly onto the glass, which is a little bit more slippery. And we have our ink here. So the inks that we use are oil-based inks. This is the Speedball Super Graphic Black ink. So we're going to be using black inks for pretty much every project in this class in Print 1. And again, this is an oil-based ink, so when you're handling these materials, make sure that you're always wearing gloves. It's very important. To get my ink open, there is this piece of tape that just goes around the lid just to help seal it, keep it fresh, and prevent the ink from drying in the can. So remove that tape first, just set it off to the side, and then we'll open it up here. To get the ink out, we're going to use an ink knife, and the ink knife is going to be located in the number 2 drawer over here, this long table. What we want to do is try to avoid the inclination to just kind of jam the knife in there and pull out a big gob of ink. So what we actually want to do is just sort of skim the ink knife around the top of the can, right? Pull some out like that. And we'll set it off here to the side. So when we're setting up our slab, ideally we want to have sort of 3 separate areas. We want to have an area where we have our mixed ink. We want to have an area to do a drawdown and then roll up our ink, and then a separate area to then apply our ink to our block or plate. So that's probably enough to start off with for right now. But if you need to get more, again, it's the same procedure. Again, just make sure that you're kind of turning this around in the can. Don't just stick the knife directly down in the ink. That will create air pockets. It's gouging the ink, right? And again, it creates air pockets. It makes the ink dry unevenly. So once you've gotten your ink out, to put it away, there's an aerosol can here. This is anti-skin spray, so just a couple sprays of that anti-skin directly onto the ink, and then just replace the lid and put the tape back around the edge. And this will just help to keep the ink from drying out and keep it fresh. All right, so to our ink, we're going to add a couple of things. We're going to modify it. So the first thing we're going to add is just a couple of drops of, this is burnt plate oil, number 00, the double-aught plate oil. So this plate oil comes in different viscosities, which is designated by different numbers. So this is kind of just the general purpose, the double-aught. And so we're just going to add a little drizzle, a couple of drops of that plate oil. So the plate oil is made from linseed oil, which is the same oil that is used as the vehicle for the pigment in the oil-based ink. So we're just going to add, again, a couple of drops of that plate oil, the double-aught plate oil, just to promote, kind of better adhesion of the ink itself. And so after we add those couple of drops of oil, I'm just going to mix it up. So we have the oil incorporated. Next, we'll add a couple of drops of, this is Cobalt Dryer. It's going to be in this small can here. So Cobalt Dryer is toxic, so you really have to be careful with it. Again, absolutely make sure that you're wearing gloves. So with the Cobalt Dryer, just a couple of drops of that directly into the ink. So just 1, 2, like that. And any excess, just try to get back into the can. Replace the lid. All right, so once you get a couple drops of the Cobalt Dryer in there as well, again, just mix that with your knife. So once all that's mixed up thoroughly, we will pull some out onto our knife. And so I'm going to apply that directly to my slab right here. All right, so this is called a drawdown. So I'm just applying some of the ink to my slab, and I'm kind of going horizontally. So now I'm going to turn my knife and I'm going to pull it down toward me. Okay, so now I'm going to take my brayer. This is called a brayer. It's basically a roller. This is one of the hard Japanese hand brayers. So especially if you have a lot of fine details and more kind of shallow marks, the hard Japanese brayers do a really good job of maintaining just a nice kind of film of ink right on the surface. It won't have a tendency, again, to push ink down into the block quite as much. All right, so I'm rolling my brayer through the ink. So the goal here is to just get a nice even application of that ink. If there's too much ink on there, it's going to make a really kind of like sloppy, sticky sort of sound, like, you know, your feet are getting stuck in the mud or something. If it's too thin, it's not going to make this kind of nice hissing sound. So this is about where you want it. So it makes a slight hissing sound. It has a slightly kind of crackly texture to it, so that's about what you want right there. Just a little bit of a texture. Again, listen for that little bit of a hissing sound. If you end up with too much ink on your slab, you can always take a knife and kind of scrape it back up, redistribute that, put it back with your ink mixed pile, and then you can just keep rolling it back out onto the clean parts of the slab to kind of flatten it out. If you don't have enough ink, obviously just pull a little bit more ink off of your ink pile, distribute it, draw it back down, and blend it out. So the key to this is going to be maintaining the same consistency of inks. The most common mistake that people make is that they'll mix up their ink, they'll roll it out, but they won't add ink to it. So progressively your prints get lighter and lighter because you're not applying more ink. About every other print or so, depending on how much black you have on your block, there's some different variables there. But you need to, again, make sure that every time before you actually apply ink to your block, that you're maintaining the same quantity of ink, right? So it has the same texture, right? All that. All right, so I'm just gonna start rolling this directly onto my block. There's a couple of things to point out. As I said before, since this block has been printed and cleaned numerous times, it's gonna be much more difficult for you to actually see the difference between the areas that are receiving ink and those that aren't. For you, the first few times that you print it, that contrast is much more apparent because you'll see the difference between where the ink is actually sitting on the block and the areas that have been carved out and removed, right? So the difference between the positive and negative parts of the image. As I apply this, I'm going to start at the bottom, just going to go up to the top. I'm not applying a lot of pressure. I also want to make sure that I'm not pushing down too hard, just kind of keeping my arm and my hand more or less parallel to the block. If I push down too hard, again, it's going to have a tendency to fill in those more kind of shallow areas. So just applying light pressure and just kind of working my way up from the bottom to the top of the block. And you can kind of go back and forth and try to fill in some areas. All right, so we'll roll up again, so just recharging my brayer with ink. Okay, so I can see that there's some spots in the middle that are not quite receiving ink yet. I have some areas in the side that are not quite receiving ink yet. So rather than continuing to go over the entire block, I'm just going to, from here on out, kind of focus on those areas. And sometimes your blocks will have a little bit of a low spot in them that's going to be kind of stubborn and not really want to receive ink. That's not, again, at all uncommon. So from here, again, because I don't want to keep just adding more ink to the block and run the risk of over-inking it, so I'm just concentrating on the areas that are not getting inked yet, so the edges, some places here in the middle. So I'm going to spot roll, so I'm going to use some of these smaller brayers here. So we have a few of those typically up here with the other brayers, and then there's also typically some, the number 5 drawer over here. So we'll just, again, spot roll in those areas. So same thing, just trying to achieve the same level of ink. All right, so now I'm focusing on these areas where I can see that ink is not on there yet. So even though it doesn't have the same degree of contrast that yours will when you initially ink yours, I can still see the difference between the areas where it's just the gray of the linoleum block coming through and the sheen of the ink. There are some times, again, if you do have like a low spot in your block, where you might have to go in varying directions to get that area to fill in, which is what I'm doing here a little bit. But kind of from the onset, when I apply ink with a brayer, I'm generally always going vertically in one direction. I don't go vertically and then come back horizontally. That also, if you have really shallow areas, you have a tendency to go against the grain more. And so you're probably more likely to pick up chatter and get ink in areas that you didn't intend to. So use one of these smaller brayers here again, just to get down here at the bottom. So I'm just basically running this right along that bottom edge where it's not quite holding ink yet. A little bit right in here. So I think this area here is probably a low spot where it's just kind of being stubborn. So it'll be more obvious once we actually print this, but having some degree of spottiness, or what we could also refer to as saltiness, or areas where it's a little bit under inked, so it's kind of grainy, you know, that can be appealing. I mean, it has a certain aesthetic quality that isn't necessarily bad, right? The only problem with that is because that's such a sort of a subtle, nuanced thing, and typically just comes by, you know, inadvertently under inking a block, that can be really difficult to reproduce. You have to be aware of what you're doing so that all the steps, right, along the way, so how much ink you have on your slab, how many times you're charging your brayer, right, how many passes with the brayer you're making on your block, all those things are sort of quantified. You know what all those variables are, again, so you can kind of use that to have more predictable results, right? Because again, the aim of this is to be able to reproduce this image as consistently as possible. I'm just kind of taking a closer look here. Looks pretty good. So I'm kind of looking to see that there's an even sheen across the entire block surface. So I think this looks good. So let's take it over the press and we will do a proof print on newsprint. And so I'm just going to set this right down on here. I'm actually going to remove my gloves because they have ink all over them, so try to keep the press pad clean. So for registration purposes, this grid, each one of these squares is a 1 inch unit, right? So if you look at just one of these squares here, that is 1 inch, right? So we can use those again to position our block and our paper respectively so that we can register or align our block, right, to our paper, to our print. So for most of you, we're probably having a 1/2 inch border. So the best way to set that up, the easiest way, is to just get as close to the center of the press pad as possible, right? There's kind of this vertex point where the vertical and horizontal axes converge. So I'm going to position my block right here. So that is from, again, that center point. That's going to be 2 small squares down and 2 small squares over, right? So if, again, each one of these squares, these blocks, represents an inch, and that is made up of 4 smaller 1/4 inch segments. Counting 2 down would be 1/2 inch, right? So again, 2 down, 2 over. So then my paper's gonna go right in that corner, right, at the center, and then my block again, 2 down, 2 over, and that'll give me 1/2 inch. Typically, these blocks are never perfectly square, so we'll just kind of have to, you know, roll with it. So in an effort to try to keep things consistent, what I would suggest doing is just picking a side. I generally suggest picking like the top edge, and just make sure that at the very least that side is always lined up. And then if one of your corners kind of trails off a little bit, at least, you know, all the prints will be aligned in the same way, even though it's not, you know, perfectly centered, it's a little bit skewed. But again, at least that way they'll kind of be more consistent. So we're going to do a proof print. So to do that, we're just going to be printing directly on to newsprint. And there will generally be a stack of newsprint over here on the table just behind the press bed. that you guys can access. So I'm just going to take a piece of newsprint. I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to just place this over my block. So for these proof prints, again, the purpose is, you know, whenever you're initially printing, it's just good practice. Also, if you're, you know, not totally sure if you're done carving, this is a good kind of trial period where you can determine if you need to go back into your block, make some things deeper, carve some more stuff out. So this is really the most accurate way to tell how things are progressing when you feel like you're done carving. So I'm just going to kind of hold this and just try to, as best I can, position this so it's straight. These are just really disposable, so I'm not that concerned, you know, about these being perfectly straight just yet. It's really, again, just for sort of practice and just to kind of gauge where things are. So on top of that newsprint, we're going to have a piece of chipboard, which again will be over here with the newsprint. So that newsprint and then the chipboard. So the chipboard is going to give us a little bit of added pressure just to help get a better impression. All right, so I'm going to pull the blankets over now. All right, and make sure that when you pull them over, you're pulling them taut. And so this is where when we have two people on press, as long as you guys are trying to maintain a safe distance between each other, one person can be helping pulling the blankets as it's going through so they don't get bound up as they travel through the press. So if you remember also, we talked about the press settings. Again, make sure that before you actually run the press, you double check the calibration. So 15/5 is what we're running these blocks on. So again, just double check that on both sides to make sure that that is what is being indicated. All right, so coming this way, we're gonna turn the crank arm clockwise. So as it's going through, and this is, again, if you have another person here, or you can do this yourself if you're able to, if you have the reach. Just try to smooth out the blankets as they go. And just a comfortable speed, just a nice kind of even, medium speed. You don't have to go super fast, just a nice comfortable speed. All right, so we get out towards the end, and we go ahead and pull the blankets back. Just make sure you pull them all the way over so that they go over the top of the press. And then, all right, so we'll peel that part off. And then we'll just carefully peel back our newsprint. All right, so there's our proof. So from this, we're kind of looking to see how consistent even the ink application is. Looks pretty good. There's a couple of little spotty areas here and there, not too bad. A little area in here in the text where I might need to check that and possibly go back in with a small gouge and carve that out. I would also be looking to see if there's any areas inside of here that I would need to go back in and address, go back in and carve some more. But generally it looks pretty good. All right, so if you are just proof printing and you would like to go back into your block and work on it more, the best thing to do to remove some of the ink is to pull some ghost prints. So to do that, basically we're just running the ink, or excuse me, running the block back through several times to try to strip off as much of that ink as we can. So I can reuse the same piece of newsprint that I had for now, and I'll just run it back through, put my chipboard down again. So coming from this direction, I'm turning it counterclockwise. Again, just trying to make sure that the blankets are kept taut as it goes through. All right, so here is our second. This is our ghost print, so as you can see, it's a lot more faded. So I would suggest doing this at least one more time, if not twice, to get off as much of that ink residue as you possibly can. But so since we're gonna go back and print again, we'll just go ahead and leave it as it is. Also, if you are not able to do all of your printing in one session, if you have to break it up into multiple sessions, I would suggest cleaning the block in the same manner in between. So after you've finish printing for the day for your first session, go ahead and clean the block just by running Ghost Print, again, to try to get off as much ink as you possibly can. And that way, you're not leaving behind a film of ink, because if a film of ink is left behind and it dries, it'll create disruptions in the surface of the block, and that'll affect the quality of your image. So make sure that you're cleaning it before you come back and print again. So now we're ready to start printing our actual paper. So again, we should already have all your paper torn down. We have the tear down video you guys should have already watched. So you should have your pile of paper ready to go. I have mine over here on that long black table. So you should have it accessible so that when you're on press, you can just grab it, keep printing, not have to stop. So same procedure as last time. I did add a little bit more ink to my slab, so I'm gonna roll that out. And again, I'm trying to get that slight crackly texture, slight kind of hissing sound. And remember that you do need to monitor your ink film. So add ink as you need to, remove ink as you need to. So that every time before you start to print, you have this same level of ink. And that's gonna help ensure that you get more consistent prints. Okay, so, and again, same as before, I'm just going to roll this directly onto my block. I'm not applying a lot of pressure. I'm not pushing down too hard. Just enough pressure to control the brayer as I move it back and forth. All right, so recharge the brayer, some more ink. So one thing to keep an eye on as well, and I'll grab another knife out of here. You want to also be looking at your slab, and if you see where there's any little dried ink pieces, a little flecks in there, take a clean knife, pick those out, and then just redeposit those somewhere out of the way so that they don't get mixed back in with your good ink. So just another thing to keep an eye on. Those dried ink spots, if they get on your brayer and transfer to your block, whenever you run it through the press, will actually print like a halo around that area, and so that area will not actually hold ink properly. Okay, so since we've already done some proof printing, I know kind of where my stubborn areas are in the block, so I'm trying to focus more on those areas. So like the edges, especially, we're being a bit stubborn, so I'm kind of focusing my attention more on those spots. Okay, so again, to spot roll, just use one of these smaller brayers so that you're just focusing on those areas that are being stubborn, not holding ink. So this edge here where it's still gray, I can see the block coming through. We'll focus on that. And see if I have any kind of under ink spots in the actual figure here, a little bit in this upper portion. So just focusing on that. All right, so I'm doing one last little kind of look over. And again, you can turn this at an angle, gives you a better idea of where you should have that nice, consistent, even sheen of the ink, and where you might have some uninked areas or under inked areas. So just a little bit down here. One important thing to note as well, with these larger brayers, after you're done with them, so after you've rolled up your blocks, always make sure that you're putting them with the roller side face up, never face down. The reason for that is the weight from the carriage and the roller will actually create flat spots in the roller, and then the ink won't be distributed evenly, and at that point they're pretty much trash. So always make sure that when you're done with them, even if you're just over here applying ink, that they are left face up. You'll notice on the cabinet where we actually keep all the brayers, they're all stored up like that. So that's a really important thing to remember, is that they're always stored with the roller portion of the brayer face up. All right, so let's take this over to the press, and we're going to try a print where we're actually using our torn down paper. All right, so same as last time, we are using a registration guide to help align our block in our paper. So the 1/2 inch there, and I have a piece of this cream Stonehenge. So there's a couple ways of doing this to actually place your paper, you can just sort of hold it sort of in a similar manner the way we did with the newsprint, just out from the edges and just try to position it over it. The way that I prefer to do it, I find easier. So with sort of like your thumb and index finger, just hold the outer edge of your paper. Again, obviously make sure that your hands are clean, free of any ink or anything that might transfer onto your paper. So grab the outermost edge of your paper, and then with your other hand, just carefully sliding it up to the line, which is, again, the sort of like vertex point where the X and Y axes of the press guide meet, and then just carefully lower it over your paper, just like that, right? Okay, so we always need to have some backing, so we'll just take a piece of newsprint, fold it over. So this newsprint backing just helps to prevent any ink from offsetting and getting onto the blankets or anything else. Especially if you have a thinner paper like a mulberry, you know, Kitakata, one of the thinner Japanese papers, it'll have a tendency to bleed and leak through, so it's definitely important to have it then. But this is just going to add, again, a little bit of extra backing. So newsprint, and then we will put our piece of chipboard on top of that as well. All right, so pull our blankets over, make sure that as we do that, we don't accidentally bump into our block and cause it to shift, right? And then again, carefully just sort of smooth the blankets out. All right, so we're gonna turn clockwise, coming from this direction, and pretty much go all the way out to the end. So positioning your block so that it's close to the center of the press makes it easier to use a registration guide, but it also helps to ensure that you don't get stuck. So you never want to have your block and your paper and everything placed out here too close to the edges, so that when you run it through, you don't accidentally get stuck underneath the press and we have to back it up, and that could mess up your print. So keeping it kind of close to the center ensures a better print, and also that you don't accidentally get your block stuck under there. All right, so just carefully, we're gonna remove this chipboard first. We can just keep it up there for now, and we'll take off the newsprint as well. So I'm gonna check to see that we've got an embossment here, so I can see where the text is kind of coming through. I can see where there's an embossment on the edge of the paper, so that's a good indication we have adequate pressure. All right, so I'm just going to take this edge here and just carefully kind of pull it up. So we'll just peel this back. All right, so there we go. So I think it was pretty good. I think I might have a little bit too much ink in some areas. Some of these spots in here I feel like are getting a little under inked. Might be losing some detail in there, so something I need to compensate for. So either, you know, just a little bit less ink. Also looking at the paper, I can see a decent amount of texture there, so I might need to thin out my ink just a little bit. All right, so as you're printing, once you get to a point where you are satisfied with your result, so again, we're going to be focusing on creating an edition to print. So that means that each one of the prints you submit in your edition needs to be virtually identical. So the same color paper, same type of paper. Your borders are consistent, right? Registration is considered, and that you have an even application of ink, right? Those kind of things. So once you get a print that you're really satisfied with, so all of those factors are there. So you have consistent borders, even borders. It's the ink film and ink quality is consistent, and you're not losing detail, things like that, right? That then becomes your master print, right? So the print from which all of your other prints will be referenced, right? So for the other prints in your edition, that will be then the print that you'll use to kind of reference and check to see that they're all the same kind of level of quality. So after you're done printing, we can bring these over here to our drying rack. So try to load these up to where we're most efficiently using all the rack space. So just have, you know, one of these entire racks, the entire row full of, completely filled up before you drop the next one down. So fill up that entire rack, and then you go ahead and pull the next one down on top of it. So once you guys are at the point where you're needing to access your prints, and the racks are getting pretty full, you have to really be careful because these are spring loaded. So the best thing you do is just ask for help either for myself or a classmate. And you want to have someone be able to pull up the rack to the point where you can access or reach what you need to get out of there. If you're not careful, these will just all kind of fly up, and then any prints that are on there will go flying off the back. So really be careful when you're trying to pull prints off the rack. But again, so just make sure before you drop the next rack down, this is completely filled up. You don't want to have prints on top of each other. Make sure you're leaving, some space in between them. But at the same time, again, make sure that you're filling up the entire rack as best as you can before you drop the next one down. So one important thing to mention, after every single print, even if you guys are just proof printing, or again, if you're actually printing your editions, you need to make sure that you're cleaning the press bed after every single print. Okay. So the way to do that is to take some mineral spirits, which will be kind of floating around here, and they'll generally be on one of the glass slabs over there. So to use this, it has a little spring-loaded plunger on it. So just turn it over, dispense some of that directly onto a paper towel, and then you can remove your block and just wipe down the press bed directly. So you don't want to apply the mineral spirits directly to the press bed itself. That will oversaturate it, and if it's not wiped down fully, you'll end up with some residue of mineral spirits on the press bed. And then when someone else comes to print, that will end up causing their print to bleed, and will affect their print. So make sure, again, it's just a little bit of mineral spirits directly on your paper towel, and then you just wipe down the entire press bed to clean it,